This episode of The Dig is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com and by Haymarket Books, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Perfect Victims in the Politics of Appeal by Mohammed El-Kurd. Palestine is a microcosm of the world, on fire, stubborn, fragmented, dignified. While a settler colonial state continues to inflict devastating violence, fundamental truths are deliberately obscured. The perpetrators are coddled, while the victims are blamed and placed on trial. Why must Palestinians prove their humanity? And what are the implications of such an infuriatingly impossible task? With fearless prose and lyrical precision, Mohammed El-Kurd refuses a life spent in cross-examination. Rather than asking the oppressed to perform a perfect victimhood, El-Kurd asks friends and foes alike to look Palestinians in the eye, foregoing both deference and condemnation. Find Perfect Victims at haymarketbooks.org, where all paperback books are 20% off every day. Welcome to The Dig, a podcast from Jacobin Magazine. My name is Danielle Denver, and I'm broadcasting from Providence, Rhode Island. Everyone and everything seem as though they're unraveling. My guest today is historian Danielle Carr. We discuss the history and present state of American unwellness and how that has been shaped by psychiatry, prescription drugs, neuroscience, popular culture, smartphones, social media, and more. We trace the rise of psychiatry as a Gilded Age human science, the disastrous contradictions of asylum deinstitutionalization, the invention of neuroscience and deep brain stimulation, Elon Musk's Neuralink fraudulence, how Adderall made the internet run, the liberal gospel of traumatic literalism recounted in The Body Keeps the Score, and the scientific Bonapartism of RFK Jr.'s medical freedom movement. Since we recorded this interview, Trump signed an executive order empowering RFK Jr. to reevaluate the prescription of SSRIs and Adderall for children. It should give us pause that the critique of Big Pharma constitutes yet another zone that has been abandoned by the left only to be colonized in bad faith by the right. RFK's anti-psychiatry vision is a dystopian one that echoes precisely the cynical capture of the anti-psychiatry movement that provided cover for the catastrophic deinstitutionalization of asylums in the 1970s and 80s. Speaking of his proposed so-called wellness farms, RFK Jr. said, quote, "Every black kid is now just standard put on Adderall, on SSRIs, benzos, which are known to induce violence, and those kids are going to have a chance to go somewhere and get reparented, to live in a community where there'll be no cell phones, no screens. You'll actually have to talk to people." Yet, as we discuss in the interview, the actual denouement of the deinstitutionalization movement looks a lot like the reckless slashing of government services currently underway courtesy of Doge. State capacity for at least housing and feeding patients who most needed it was eliminated with the promise that it would be replaced by something that, in principle, sounded good. Socially informed care integrating patients into the daily lives of the community. The problem was that with the right's co-optation of the anti-psychiatry movement, legitimate and important critiques of existing care were used as a cover to eliminate that admittedly flawed care and replace it with absolutely nothing. Nothing save for homelessness and mass incarceration. Long-term inpatient psychiatric care was dismantled. The promised support system that was supposed to replace it never materialized. In this episode, we discuss what a productive left critique of psychiatry might look like, one that contests rather than simply cedes ground to the right's faux health populism. Before we get this started, this podcast, the Dig Podcast, the podcast you are now listening to, it is overwhelmingly supported by listeners like you at patreon.com/thedig. You probably know this by now, but we, The Dig, are a nonprofit political education project. That's why we don't paywall episodes to generate more revenue. We would generate a ton more revenue if we did, but that's not the point. We want every single person possible to listen to the podcast. And it's you voluntarily supporting The Dig that makes that all possible. We also have books, tote bags, coffee mugs for Patreon supporters in the United States, depending on how much you contribute. For those of you who live elsewhere, depending on your contribution, we have ebooks to send. Every contributor gets our excellent occasional newsletter sent to your email inbox. That's patreon.com/thedig. Danielle Carr is a historian and professor at UCLA. She writes about the political history and present of the brain sciences. Danielle Carr, welcome to The Dig.
Thank you so much. I'm so happy to be here.
I feel like a lot of people have the feeling that a lot of people are going insane. People feel like they themselves are going insane. They're watching Elon Musk normalize being a very scary sort of insane person in public and in power. They're watching friends struggle. Suicide rates have been increasing. Americans are killing themselves and each other in huge numbers with guns and drug overdoses. What's going on? Is it always like this? Does it always feel like this? Or are the social fabric and individual humans really sort of unraveling right now?
I mean, I think it's a good question. Are things actually more insane in the sense of, is there a higher incidence of what could be apprehended as like a psychiatric illness? Or is there just an increase in measurements and categorization of ordinary level of human distress that is increasingly called mental illness? I do think you have to take seriously that, for instance, rates of suicide since 2000 have increased by about 30%. So I think there are two things going on here. I think, first of all, there is a severe deterioration of quality of life, strength of, let's say, the social fabric and generally the forms of social safety nets that people have available to them. Like, life is certainly getting worse for most people. And you can see that being reflected in increasing rates of mood disorder, let's say, or let's say sadness and despair that is apprehended by the medical establishment as being mood disorder. And so, like, in that sense, I do think that we need to take seriously the idea that increasing rates of distress, which includes psychiatric distress or emotions that are manifested as psychiatric distress, do mean something about the way that an ordinary person's life is going now. And of course, this is like compounded by things, isolation during COVID. So there's that. I think a lot of times in, let's say, like liberal mainstream media, there's this discourse of like, Trump is so crazy. American politics has gone so crazy. And like, it's like, have you guys ever heard of like Ross Perot? Like, I don't think there is meaningfully.
Or it was pretty crazy when George W. Bush invaded Iraq.
Yeah, exactly.
That was wild.
Yeah, I do think that there is like a level of zaniness to American politics and certainly to American right-wing politics, especially since, like, let's say, the late 80s, that does not really strike me as valid, but I do think that we can take seriously the increases in psychiatric distress.
And you mentioned COVID and the isolation that resulted from that, and that isolation was also with our phones, which we've been spending a lot of time with since they came online in 2007, 2008, and that's only gotten worse since.
Yeah, I mean, I think like there are a variety of also technological, infrastructural things. Like, it is generally not good for your so-called mental health to be spending 8 hours a day on your phone. Like that, nobody thinks that is salutary to human flourishing.
You write, quote, "A crisis that affects mental health is not the same thing as a crisis of mental health." Why is it that we have so much pathologization of individual mental illness and so little diagnosis of our sick and brutal capitalist society, which is so clearly the underlying problem in so many cases. I mean, maybe the answer is rather obvious, that powerful forces benefit from the status quo, and they also benefit from mystifying why the status quo is the way that it is.
I think you can say that it happens at the intersection of multiple interests without positing conspiracy, right? Like that's how most of reality works. And in that sense, certainly from the perspective of the powers that be, politicians, so on and so forth, it is much more amenable to the sort of things that they want to do to gloss increasing unlivability of life as being increasing rates of psychiatric disorder. And for their part, I mean, I think since the establishment of psychiatry and the mind and brain sciences more generally, of course, psychiatrists want to claim increasing relevance for their discipline, whether that be making claims through public policy. A good analogy maybe is I think a lot about after Eric Adams fired the lifeguards in New York because they wanted a raise, there was an increase in the incidences of drowning. And Eric Adams then held a press conference on the drowning crisis, right? And so I think that there's this way that symptoms or general collapse of particular infrastructures of safety of a livable life, the symptoms can be isolated and medicalized in a way that is very convenient for those in power. And I think I don't think it's like rocket science to point that
out. Today he might call them DEI lifeguards.
Wokely saving lives.
This dynamic is far from new. It goes back to the very origin of psychiatry, which you wrote about in a 2018 essay for Jacobin that I highly recommend people check out. The very invention of the discipline or the field or whatever, it was advocated as a response to working class militancy and funded by Gilded Age wealth. How did that happen? How did psychiatry emerge at the intersection of massive Gilded Age wealth and progressive era new liberal ideology, all while co-opting a grassroots campaign to improve conditions for asylum patients?
I mean, I think this gets back to the question that we opened with. Do you have historical periods where you do objectively see an increase in biological states that could be apprehended as psychiatric illness? So, in the late 19th century, especially in the United States, there is rampantly increasing wealth inequality. You have sort of disintegration of kinship networks and care networks through the family that had demarcated agrarian life as people flock to urban areas and, are crowded in flop houses in this sort of increasingly industrialized economy. And you do see just increased levels of social disintegration from increases in at least reported incidences of domestic violence to increased reported cases of psychosis, quote unquote, nervous breakdown, things of that nature. And in the absence of familial kinship networks, the state does have to take on care for the so-called indigent. And so you have the rise of the asylum system, but the problem is that, asylums were essentially carceral institutions in the sense that there were not active scientific treatments that could really be offered in the early 20th century. There were maybe some barbiturates, but there was not a wide variety of effective psychiatric medications that could really be used. And so the function of the asylum was essentially to house people who had fallen through the social safety network. And so at the turn of the century, you have the rise of this aspiration that psychiatry will establish itself as a legitimate medical science and go beyond merely custodial care and develop active scientific treatments, much like the rest of medicine. And this is really led by a neuropathologist, a Swiss neuropathologist named Adolf Meyer, who does things like establish the first psychiatric institution in the United States that does active scientific treatment, the Boston Psychopathic Hospital. And Meyer's vision for psychiatry is that it will establish itself not just as a legitimate medical field, but begin to reach into what he apprehends as fields of public policy, of social disorder, labor problems, so on and so forth, and really come into public prominence and make bids for things like state funding. And so one of the key ways that this happens is through an alliance with the Rockefeller Foundation. The Rockefeller Foundation, of course, is established by the Rockefeller family on the basis of their enormous Gilded Age wealth. But in the early 20th century, they make a switch from just doing charity work, essentially directly supporting orphans, widows, so on, to thinking that they are going to establish new fields like psychiatry, like human relations, like labor, like psychology, to study labor problems. And so the Rockefeller Foundation really begins looking for different grassroots organizations in mental health to fund. One of the things that they hit on is an establishment called the National Committee for Mental Hygiene that was started by a guy named Clifford Beers, who's this upper middle class guy. He actually goes to Yale, who has a nervous breakdown in 1900. And by 1907, he's established a grassroots movement to reform care in asylums, because as you can imagine, these are terrible places to be. There, there's
and he spent like 3 or 4 years there or something, and it was horrible.
Horrible. I mean, there's people are confined, like tied to their beds. There's beatings, there's rapes. It's not good. And so the National Committee for Mental Hygiene was a campaign to reform conditions in asylums. But what essentially happens, and it was essentially a movement of ex-patients or family members of ex-patients who knew what these conditions were like. And with Rockefeller's support and ultimately co-optation, this becomes an organization campaigning for the extension of psychiatry into the workplace, into public policy, into legislation, the establishment of the psychiatrist as a sort of technician of adjustment for even everyday normal people, and to increase the reach and ambit of psychiatry into everyday life. And so
instead of the idea that the labor movement and socialists and communists are putting out there pretty emphatically during the final decades of the 19th century and first decades of the 20th, this idea that you have a major problem of immiseration founded in economic exploitation that should be solved by the working class seizing the state and socializing the means of production. Instead of that diagnosis and that solution, you have psychiatry funded by the Rockefeller Foundation taking this new liberal progressive era ideology that says the actual problem is that workers do not understand their subordinate place in what should be an otherwise harmonious social whole. That failure to be at peace with their subordinate place in the social whole is what causes them to be disordered and mentally ill.
Yeah, I mean, I think as always, it's the question that psychiatry tries to answer is a crisis of what? And at this particular moment, when you have really rampant and militant labor organizing, you have strikes, you have, for instance, like the Ludlow massacre, in which the state is unleashing deadly violence on workers. I think new liberals look at this social crisis and think that the problem is that the psychopathological individual has failed to adjust to their life circumstances, and we can restore a sort of fundamentally harmonious social whole, right? A fundamentally harmonious social whole that is not riven by class conflict, notably in like the liberal conceptual universe, and reestablish a healthy and indeed organic social body by helping people to adjust to their life circumstances. So for Meyer, the idea of adjustment in psychiatry being a sort of technical, psychiatrists are technicians of adjustment for the everyday person, become very, very important. And it's important to think too about all the sort of adjacent fields that the Rockefeller Foundation funded under the ambit of the mind and brain sciences. So for instance, in 1929, only a few weeks after the Black Tuesday, the big stock market crash, the Rockefeller Foundation institutionalizes or founds the Institute for Human Relations at Yale University, which is this interdisciplinary center that establishes a wide variety of these like new human sciences, ranging from psychiatry, psychology, sociology. Elton Mayo, for instance, who specializes in studying workers to try to increase efficiency, that's his first big academic appointment. The Hawthorne studies, for instance, come out of the IHR.
This seems very resonant with Taylorism.
Yes, indeed. A lot of studies of efficiency and how to minimize conflict between management and workers come out of IHR. And so psychiatry has to be understood as just one of this kind of archipelago of emerging, let's say, human sciences in the early 20th century that are specifically grounded in this liberal vision of a harmonious social whole that individuals must adjust to, and a failure to adjust to this harmonious social whole is constitutive of psychopathology.
A few decades after psychiatry's foundation, the field was met with the challenge of the anti-psychiatry movement of the 1960s and 70s. That movement, I think, we mostly remember for tragically helping to bring about the deinstitutionalization of mentally ill people who were freed from mental institutions, which, think One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, were still really, really bad, only to be thrown onto the street or into prison. And in that way, really coinciding with the neoliberal gutting of the welfare state. You write, quote, "The anti-psychiatry movement's biggest failure was that it took the biological to be the opposite of the political, rather than a site where politics happens." What was the anti-psychiatry movement? And what do you mean when you describe this as its fundamental failure?
In the post-war period, the 1950s to the mid-1960s, there is a sense of optimism about what is called the biological revolution, where you have the rise of molecular biology and genetic sequencing and a variety of great leaps forward in biological medicine. And there is this optimism that there will be in psychiatry the same sort of great leap forward. And this really fails to materialize, to say the least, a failure to materialize that persists to the present day. You do have the introduction of, for instance, chlorpromazine and MAOIs in the 1950s, but there really are not huge leaps forward that keep pace with the rest of medicine. I mean, in some ways, lobotomy was supposed to be, and psychosurgery was supposed to be that great leap forward. And the revelation of widespread abuse of lobotomy really puts a wrench in psychiatry's bid to frame itself as being just like the rest of medicine, just as legitimate as the rest of medicine. That combined with things like Life magazine runs a big expose of conditions. I think it's Bridgewater State Hospital. You have One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest. You have the documentary by Fred Wiseman, Titty Cut Follies. And so by kind of the mid-1960s, you have this sort of bipartisan sense that the institutional system of state asylums and involuntary psychiatric care is not working out. What's interesting about the anti-psychiatry movement, I think, in terms of its political composition, is that it's such a strange bedfellows moment. In some ways, it sort of resembles the way that both the left and the RFK right have critiques of like food regulation and like the poisoning of the American body. I think what should be noted about the anti-psychiatry movement in the mid to late 1960s is that it really was a critique of the carceral system equally.
And this is sort of coincident with a moment in American life where there's sort of a rebellion against the organization man being churned out by all of these mass institutions of this gray, orthodox, standardized American mid-century life that's emerged.
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think that there is, this kind of countercultural sensibility about authenticity, as well as very valid critiques of homosexuality was still a disorder listed in the DSM. And so there were a lot of very valid critiques of the psychiatric establishment and the ambit and claims that psychiatry was arrogating to itself. So that's from the left. And as well, you have, for instance, one of the big pillars of the anti-psychiatry movement on the left, at least, was a critique of a line of research that was being funded by, for instance, like Governor Reagan's law enforcement or Justice Department and the law enforcement administration grants that do things like fund the LAPD's first set of helicopters. There is a lot of carceral state funding that is going into trying to find the biological basis of aggression that psychiatrists and neurophysiologists who are making bids for this funding are saying like, oh, well, these riots in Watts, these riots in Detroit, this racial unrest might actually be caused by a physiological proclivity to violence in, I don't know, some populations. And we all know, like which populations, right? There's a racialization of violence that happens beginning in the mid 1960s. And so this critique of biological racism in the state's alliance with the mind and brain sciences is a pillar of the left's critique of psychiatry. From the right, however, there is also a sort of libertarian sensibility that emerges, perhaps best embodied by Thomas Szasz, the Hungarian psychiatrist, that essentially wants the state out of any form of psychiatric treatment. And part of the reason for this is just Szasz is a libertarian. The other reason for this is that Szasz has this idea that like schizophrenia is that essentially mental illness is completely socially constructed. It's not real at all. It does not have any biological basis. And you begin to see sort of this creep in the movement through the late 1960s and especially into the early 1970s, where, I think some very legitimate critiques of the social construction of mental illness begin to bleed into this bargain basement Foucauldianization of the idea of discourse, that there's no biological basis at all or any sort of biological legitimacy to any kind of psychiatric disease categories. And, it eventually kind of manifests in, for instance, like Deleuze's clinic at Laborde, which is to innovate non-carceral care for people with what we would now call schizophrenia. It sort of becomes, in its peregrinations through the left, this idea that schizophrenia is good, actually, which is, I think, to say the least, a real misapprehension of the situation. And so you have this kind of like melange of different ideas in the mix that become the basis for what becomes known as deinstitutionalization.
So you set the scene really well here. How then does deinstitutionalization play out in the sort of catastrophic way that it does?
There's a really wonderful report that comes out of Ralph Nader's office in 1974 called The Madness Establishment that I really encourage people to get a copy of if they're interested in this. But essentially, it details what exactly went wrong in the community health movement. So in 1963, Kennedy signs the Community Mental Health Center Act into law. And the idea is that instead of these big hulking asylums, state hospitals, psychiatric care is going to be moved into the community. So people will go during the day to receive treatment or participate in programs, but can be reintegrated into the community, at night or on weekends. And so you don't have the idea was that you were not going to have this strong divide between the institution, what Goffman at the time is like calling a total institution, and the outside community. The problem is that, first of all, the funding structure for how this was going to be a long-term transformation of the psychiatric care system was never really fleshed out. So these centers, only half of which were ever built, actually, would be funded for maybe 2 years, maybe 4 years. But after that, it really was not specified by the legislation, like where this funding was going to come from. And so many of these centers that do end up getting built have to transition 5 or 6 years into their existence to only treating people who can pay or have insurance. This is a huge problem, as you can imagine, because the people who are coming out of these long-term state psychiatric institutions are not the sort of people who have insurance. There's also a huge problem just in terms of execution, where people who were released from long-term asylum care were not really followed up with. So only 13% of people who end up in these community mental health centers are from the population that was released from long-term psychiatric care. And so it really is a debacle. And the point is that essentially 90% of hospital bed capacity for psychiatric patients is eliminated on the basis of this coming capacity. And this is step one of deinstitutionalization, but step two never actually emerges, where that population is absorbed into a new system because the new system really doesn't get built. And so it's, I think, pretty well established in the sociological literature around this that what happens to that population? Well, the enormous growth of the U.S. carceral system is what absorbs that population.
You had this sort of liberatory Great Society gesture at the height of liberalism, but when it came to the second step of actually building institutions that could compassionately care for these people, that happened when neoliberalism was on the rise.
Yeah, I think it really was. It did, in effect, deinstitutionalization was just the elimination of any state capacity for long-term, not just psychiatric care, but housing, social services, essentially concentrated in one building. And of course, there were abuses, and of course, there were many problems with this system, but it was the total elimination of this system very rapidly, indeed, without any long-term planning for what kind of systems could take up the slack of that care.
How in the 1980s, as deinstitutionalized people moved on to the streets, into the growing ranks of homelessness and into a massively expanding prison system, the early years of what would become a more and more and more grotesquely giant system of mass incarceration, how at this moment did psychiatry become so enmeshed with the pharmaceutical industry and biotechnology? What drove that convergence at that time, and what have the consequences been?
Yeah, I think that the story of the 80s and 90s in terms of psychiatry is in many ways the story more broadly of what happens to science under the Reagan years. So you have a series of changes to the way that science is done, including the Bayh-Dole Act, for instance, that pushes university scientists into privatizing publicly funded science, that sort of establishes this figure of the scientist entrepreneur that is now at the center of so much biotech research. And you have the explosion of a wide variety of pharmaceuticals, including psychiatric pharmaceuticals, for a sort of middle-class consumer population. And so you have a real growth in the rates of, let's say, or everyday, ordinary people who are not in manic depressive states and are not in psychotic states. Increasingly, this population of I don't want to say ordinary in a normative sense, but let's say ordinary in a sort of a demographic sense, are increasingly taking a wide variety of pharmaceuticals, including psychiatric pharmaceuticals that are being marketed to them through like direct-to-consumer marketing. That's one thing. The other thing is in 1980, right, which is like coincidence with the Reagan years, is the establishment of Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, which is widely shorthanded as like psychiatry's nosological Bible. It's like the list of legitimate diagnoses. It's in
The DSM.
The DSM that is sort of installed as the document of legitimacy that is going to coordinate between insurers, research, and clinicians. And so it's like this is the list of diagnoses that we're going to take to be legitimate disease entities. Suddenly, there had been a first and a second version of the DSM prior to DSM-3, but this sort of the revolution in psychiatry's relevance and renewed aspiration to finding legitimate biological and medical treatments is really, let's say, periodizable to DSM-3 in 1980. And what this does is sort of widely expand the number of people who could be apprehended to or described as having psychiatric illness. For instance, like to name the two real growth categories, depression becomes a huge like growth market. Anxiety becomes a huge growth market, and it's no accident.
SSRIs,
right?
Klonopin.
It's no accident that these are the blockbuster drugs of the 90s and the early 2000s.
You wrote a really interesting piece on ADHD and Adderall. Interesting and very funny. And for people who haven't read your work, you are a very, very funny writer. And you write that the standard critique of mass prescription of Adderall is that we in fact have an attention crisis that's caused by things like our phones, and that this is a underlying problem that cannot be treated through medicalization, diagnosis, and an Adderall prescription. But you argue that it's deeper than that and weirder, really, that the mass prescription of amphetamines has been driving the underlying attention problem all along, and that it's people getting hooked on Adderall that got everyone hooked on wasting so much time online in the first place. Taking speed all the time, you write, makes us all into perfect internet subjects. Quote, "The most online one can be is on Adderall. Is there anything better? Where does the time go? There is always another tab to open, another reel to watch. In retrospect, it's hard to think of a single bastion of millennial culture, which is to say smartphone cusp internet culture, whose essential features are not deducible from the premise that everyone involved was gacked to high heaven on Adderall." Let's unpack this history and this analysis that you're making. Why did everyone get prescribed Adderall in the first place? And how did being high on speed then facilitate internet addiction? And then lastly, how do you take account of the result, which we touched on a little at the top of the interview, this result of social media and the internet, our phones? How do you take account for how our attachment to these digital appendages, our new cyborg reality, how is that remade and is remaking our subjectivities and just basic experiences of being human on this earth?
So I think like this is a great example of where the 1970s It's All Discourse actually critique of psychiatry fails. Because if you say like ADHD isn't real, it's just invented to sell and legalize amphetamines, it's like, yeah, okay, but you do have to take account the very real physiological effects of what is an extremely powerful drug. So I guess maybe I'll just like outline briefly what happens with Adderall in the 90s. Adderall is like approved by the FDA and goes on the market in 1996.
But am I right that it's Ritalin that's more pervasive first? Like when I first had friends who were prescribed amphetamines in maybe early middle school, late elementary school, I'm not sure, in the early 90s, it was Ritalin, and then it became Adderall. I don't know why.
Yeah. Okay. So amphetamine salts have been used in psychiatric treatment since the 1920s. And I mean, there's a lot, like you can read Norman Ohler's book, for instance, about like how the Nazis were on meth straight up. And like this explains Blitzkrieg, things like that. So the use of amphetamine salts is not new, but one of the things I found in the course of this piece that I've never been able to do anything with this specifically, but by like I think it was the 1970s, Obitrol was an amphetamine salt that was prescribed for weight loss, right? And you have this sort of panic around the widespread use of amphetamines that results in the first crackdown that puts amphetamines on this sort of Schedule II list. But still, things like Ovitrol are used off-label by psychiatrists like into the 1990s. So where Adderall comes from actually is that there's the company that's manufacturing Ovitrol gets sold to a new owner in this sort of like crazy through the looking glass financialization of the pharmaceutical industry that happens under Reagan. And the new owner notices that there is a child psychiatrist in Provo, Utah, who is prescribing huge amounts of Ovitrol off-label to children. Now, what's going on in Provo, Utah? It is the center of this sort of like child behavioral intervention industry that is, for instance, like described by Paris Hilton. This guy, I mean, do what you will with this. This guy's office is less than a mile from Provo Canyon School. Just the sheer amount of Ovitrol being prescribed by this child psychiatrist to children suggests that, that there might be a use for Ovitrol, which is rebranded as Adderall and sort of comes onto the market in this moment in, for instance, the American educational system where there's like an increasing use of standardized testing. There's an increasing push to tertiary education that's going to become dispositive of whether or not you're going to make it in like Clinton's new information economy. There's a variety of factors that go into, let's say, institutionalizing the widespread use of amphetamines among upper middle class, well-insured children. Previously, like in the 70s, Ritalin was like tested on, for instance, Black children in state care. It was actually a huge scandal that, for instance, like the Black Panthers protested against. And so you have this change in the class valence of the meaning and prescription patterns of amphetamines that suddenly become this way of getting ahead in the information economy. And one of the things that happens is that within elite college networks, everybody's taking Adderall, right? It's like very, very normalized. And especially within the class of people that are going to form the foot soldiers of the so-called attention economy, the people at Gawker, the people writing listicles, the people staffing McSweeney's, right? Like the people who are in the early first iterations of like Tumblr blogs. These people are on Adderall. They write about it. The first wave of internet writing, like Tao Lin, like everybody is on Adderall. And so the argument I make in the piece is that we need to think about these things dialectically in the sense that there is an establishment of this sort of information economy architecture, aka the first round of the internet, in its sort of post-smartphone iteration, that has to be understood in some way as being epiphenomenal too, or there is some sort of causation between the rise of Adderall usage in the 90s among this particular class of people and what the internet ends up looking like, such that downstream, I don't think it is actually an accident that the cure for the so-called attention crisis that this like internetification of everything has produced is precisely the same thing that I would argue precipitated and marked the culture of the thing in the first place. And so, if you think about the way that amphetamines work neurologically, they increase the general bioavailability of things like of neurotransmitters like dopamine. Flooding your system with dopamine makes you much more vulnerable to things like gambling addiction, intermittent reward schedules, essentially, where it's not, there's a sort of gambling effect about, for instance, like when you refresh your likes, will there be likes? How many will there be? This is an intermittent reward schedule. The people who invented the like button are very straightforward about this being modeled on gambling technologies. There's a wonderful book called Addiction by Design by an anthropologist named Natasha Dahl-Scholl that charts the direct genealogy between the development of very addictive video gambling in the 90s to the sort of architecture of intermittent reinforcement in social media platforms. And so I think that we have to understand these things as not just discourse, but changes in bodies at a population level over time that is perhaps best analogized through things like the sort of thing that early 20th century hygiene movements were trying to address, like a large population of bodies exposed to particular forms of infrastructural and environmental harm.
This is so fascinating, and there's like three kind of jumbled points I want to make. One, in the late 90s and early aughts, it wasn't just that this was being prescribed to a lot of people. It was then being sold and shared and snorted by many, many more people when I was in high school, late 90s, early aughts.
Right. And so the official rates of diagnosis and usage do not capture the prevalence within a particular class of emerging knowledge and media workers.
Then two, Provo, Utah is also the cultural capital, not Salt Lake City, Provo, of the Mormon Church, which is just, I'm just going to put that out there. Don't know if there's anything to it.
Yeah, no comment, but, people should think about that.
This idea of American education falling behind in the 1980s and 90s, that was also the same context, incidentally, that really turbocharged what came to be known as education reform or corporate education reform, charters, et cetera.
Yeah, I think that that's a great point. And I think the problem with this sort of 70s anti-psychiatry thing, let's say like genre of critique that says, well, it's all discourse, and in fact, like there is no pathology going on here, is that it does not really take seriously or apprehend the fact that changes in infrastructure at the level of, the establishment of the internet or the widespread use of standardized testing or things like that do have downstream biological effects at a population level, right? And so to say ADHD is not real, well, there are several things that we could mean by that. One, we could mean by that it is the medicalization of something that is actually normal in a statistical or demographic sense. That, I think, is true in some ways. In general, the attention spans that are populationally normal, demographically normal right now, are qualitatively and quantitatively quite different from the normal attention spans of the 1990s, not to mention the 1950s.
People are having more trouble reading books these days,
to say the least. Right? Like if you look at the declines in literacy of even since COVID, it really is shocking. But another way that we could mean that that ADHD is not real is that it is only used. It's like only a sort of discursive trick, the invention of a category to sell pharmaceuticals to children. And it's like, in some ways, it's like vulgar Marxism will get you 90% of the way in a lot of critiques, but there's something that is not explained by that sort of really straightforward cui bono argument. And that is there are biological changes that are precipitated by infrastructural changes. It is true that there are neurological effects to widespread smartphone usage. Addiction at a population level is a biological effect. And so I do think that we have to take biology not as a given, which is to say that it is the opposite of politics, but like biology unfolds in history. Biology unfolds in politics, which is to say biology is a part of the conjuncture. And in the same way that early 20th century hygiene movements fought at the state level for regulations for clean water, clean air, ventilated housing, things like that, workplace protection. I think that this actually is maybe a more valuable model for thinking about how to fight these kinds of incursions on health than what the anti-psychiatry movement, especially in the early 1970s, provides. I want to say one more thing on this, because I think that when we on the left now think back to early 20th century hygiene movements, there is this idea and maybe like disquiet, and rightfully so, with how much of that movement was imbricated with eugenic ideas, right? This idea that the population could be engineered into increasing forms of fitness or purity, however defined, which, needless to say, ended up just being scientific racism in many cases. But I think that when we say that there is absolutely no political critique of biology, or that there is no politics to biology, what we end up doing is really punting on a very important question, which is, what forms of life do we want to work towards as people on the left? And I think that's that's a debate that we need to have. And certainly I don't think that, needless to say, I don't think that racial engineering is the answer. I hope that's clear. But I do think it is not out of the question for me that the left should have some sort of conversation without naturalizing the question, without saying that, oh, this is straightforwardly deducible from some sort of normative biology, but still with full understanding that this is a question that is inflected through value judgments, aka it is political. What do we think about the question of what forms of attention we would like to foster and enable at a population level? Do we think that people should, in general, be able to finish a book? And to me, I would say yes. And we can't shy away from these sorts of questions about what might be apprehended as biological engineering, because the biological is in fact a site of politics, right? And so I think that we do just fine a lot of the times with these questions when it comes to abortion, right? We don't punt on the question there. And I don't think that we should punt on the question when it comes to the embodied capacity of populations to sustain particular levels of attention, or in general, not on balance experience despair, or, things like that.
Yeah, I mean, this brings us full circle to our discussion about the anti-psychiatry movement. And your line, quote, the anti-psychiatry movement's biggest failure was that it took the biological to be the opposite of the political, rather than a site where politics happens.
Yeah, I mean, I think that you got to thread the needle really carefully here, because, of course, it is very easy to fall into a kind of neo-eugenics thinking. I guess we'll talk about this later a bit once we get into the trauma piece. But I think when so much of this kind of attachment theory thinking, this new discourse of the neurobiologization of trauma, taken in one sense, can essentially rearticulate discourses of race, for instance, in the idiom of neurobiology, particularly trauma-based neurobiology. And we have to be careful to not do that. However, the human subject is embodied. And even though psychiatry is really not very far along at all in correlating any particular biophysiological state with any particular subjective state, we do know that any subjective state is ultimately correlated to some biological reality. And so I don't think that we necessarily need to do this kind of work through psychiatry, through the idiom of psychiatry or neuroscience, because it's as I'm sure we'll get into, these are knowledge formations that were in many ways created to foreclose collective organizing, leftist struggle, so on and so forth. But I do think that we need to take seriously the embodiedness of cognition and think about that as also being a site of struggle without merely fainting into the arms of essentially neoliberal bromides about neurodiversity or so on and so as a way of kind of punting on the question of what kind of biological capacities do we want the infrastructures of everyday life to facilitate.
Speaking of appeals to neurodiversity, this conversation, unfortunately and inevitably, leads us to Elon Musk. For those listeners who missed it, that was the excuse offered for his, was it 2 or 3 SIG-Hail Nazi salutes?
I'm not neurodiverse enough to fully keep up with it. But.
And I mean, God, having to think about Musk all the time is really, truly one of the most painful things about being alive right now for me, personally speaking.
Yeah, I mean, we all knew that the end of America was coming, but who knew that it was going to be like epically pwned themed? It was just like, it's ghastly.
One of the less well-known companies that Musk owns is Neuralink. According to its one-word mission statement, the company aims to, quote, create a generalized brain interface to restore autonomy to those with unmet medical needs today and unlock human potential tomorrow. What medical issues does Neuralink claim it can fix today? What sort of human potential does Musk promise he can unlock for us tomorrow? And what does that all reveal about certain dominant ideologies emanating from Silicon Valley and now, unfortunately, stretching all the way to Trump's White House?
Okay, maybe I'll just start here by talking about kind of what happens between the first wave of brain implant, brain-computer interface, or BCI research, and its revival in the early 2000s, and where this kind of fits in the history of psychiatry, which is something I address in my forthcoming book, listeners. In any case...
Because, there's a whole prehistory to all this. This all feels very fancy, new, sci-fi, brave new world of the present, but this was actually core to the mid-20th century invention of the field of neuroscience.
Yes, which is an argument that I make, essentially, that the a lot of times I think Silicon Valley, especially biotech, runs on hype, which is very reliant on ideas of novelty, revolutionary breakthroughs. And I think one of the first things to be said—
It's one big meme coin.
Yeah, exactly. Is that the technologies for human brain implants, BCIs, the computers to which those implants are coupled have changed. But the basic architecture of sticking an electrode in different parts of the brain and either taking a readout of data or distributing electrical stimulation really have not changed so very much. The number of electrodes obviously has changed, but the basic idea behind the technology really has not changed very much since it's, putting electrodes in the nervous system and in the brain was a key part of the discipline of neurophysiology throughout the early 20th century. And by 1951, this technology was being tested in human patients in New York at Mass General. I think one of the things that's important to note about this is that there is a sort of oscillation in the development of 20th century psychiatry between chemical and electrical paradigms of the brain. That is, should the brain primarily be considered as an electrical organ that communicates with itself and the external world through information, or information mediated electrically, or should the brain primarily be considered as a sort of organ that operates through chemical signaling? Of course, the answer is both, but realistically, there are oscillating periods of hegemony between these two camps throughout the 20th century in psychiatry. So in the 1920 to the mid-1950s, the electrical paradigm was very dominant. The neurophysiologists were the big swinging dicks of the mind and brain sciences. In fact, it's the neurophysiologists who establish neuroscience as such. And it really is not until the introduction of psychopharmaceutical drugs like chlorpromazine and the sort of move towards pharmaceuticals that dominates the late 70s to throughout the sort of heyday of psychopharmaceuticals that I would argue lasts until like around 2005, that the chemical paradigm really takes hold. So that's one thing. Also, like, you have to understand that the first development of brain implants for use in human patients was essentially shut down in the mid-1970s through this anti-psychiatry movement that was protesting things like the testing of these technologies in incarcerated populations. I can talk more about that later if you'd like. But what happens in really the 1990s is this idea that psychiatric pharmaceuticals are going to be developed that can act as essentially magic bullets for things like depression, which is, increasingly diagnosed at a demographic level. And by the early 2000s, right, there is a sort of growing disaffection with the promises of this chemical paradigm, the psychiatric pharmaceutical paradigm of psychiatry, which is that, like, as the meta-analyses begin to roll in and exposés about how much of the research on, for instance, SSRIs had been directly funded by or engineered by pharmaceutical companies, and as the meta-analyses begin to show, like, in aggregate, that SSRIs do not function very much better than placebo a lot of the time, a third of patients with depression are just not helped by them. I think psychiatry begins to kind of cast around for alternative paradigms for treatment. And in that moment, brain implants, brain stimulation becomes a viable alternative mode in the failure of psychiatric pharmaceuticals. So that's one thing to be said. The other thing that begins happening, let's say around 2010, is so psychiatry is always trying to rebrand itself as now, this time, we really, really, really are a valid biological science. This happens.
We are the hardest of the hard scientists.
Right. Like we are not just the refuge for, like, the worst medical students. Like, we are also legitimate medical scientists. And so this happens in, like, Adolf Meyer's push for a new scientific psychiatry. This happens with the 1980 DSM, in which the chairman, Robert Spitzer, basically affects this total biologization of most of the diagnoses and then relegates all of the psychoanalytic diagnoses to basically axis 2, which is, like, fake as far as most psychiatrists are concerned, the personality disorders. And this really happens again in the 2010s in a moment that then is best periodized by the 2013 announcement of the Obama Brain Initiative. But I think that there was actually a real sense in psychiatry in the late noughties, early 2010s of, this is embarrassing as a field that we are in this state where the grand promises of the decade of the brain in the 1990s and the sort of, like, slick fMRI imaging and PET scanning that had been so exciting in the 1990s were not really producing revolutionary clinical treatments that you would expect. And so into this breach, you have steps the revivification of the brain implant for psychiatric disorder research program. So there had been deep brain stimulation is what the technology is typically called now, and a lot of the brain implant systems are variations on deep brain stimulation. So for the purpose of this conversation, I'm just going to call it DBS. DBS had already been established as a gold standard treatment for movement disorders, especially Parkinson's and essential tremor. And, is cleared by the FDA. You stick an electrode system into the whatever the neural target is, depending on where the tremor is. But you can really effectively address movement disorder through electrical stimulation because movement disorder is very easy to map. You can create topological maps of the brain that's like, here is where this particular movement is.
If you do a charge here, someone's leg will spring out, whatever. That is easy to map.
Right. And so there is, a pretty much empirically testable and verifiable one-to-one correlation between neural target and, let's say, desired behavioral outcome. So brain stimulation for movement disorder is in a pretty good state. Indeed, this is why Neuralink and so on, all of these new BCI companies, although they might be making, and indeed are making, enormously inflated claims about their capacity to treat any type of psychiatric disorder, in real life, the clinical trials are for movement disorder because the state of the field remains the state of the field, which is pretty good, right? The question is that aspiration generalizable from movement disorder to psychiatric disorder? And I can get into why I think the answer is a resounding no later. But let's just stick with periodization here. So there is the rise of an aspiration in the 2010s on the basis of this sort of disillusionment with the chemical psychopharmaceutical paradigm. The rise of an aspiration for a new correlationist project. This indeed powered the rise of the DSM-3, which is often described as neo-Kraepelinian. Kraepelin was a psychiatrist that was really thought that there was discrete functions, behavioral functions, that could be localized into particular nodes, locations in the brain. And the DSM is based on the idea that this is true, and even though we don't know what those correlations are, eventually we will figure them out, such that even though we don't yet know what depression or schizophrenia is on a biological basis, we are sure that it does correspond to some discrete biological disease entity, and one day we will be able to elaborate that correlationism. By the 2010s, and especially around the Obama Brain Project, it was kind of the check coming due epistemically on the discipline of psychiatry as it was, wanting to sort of save itself by increasingly fusing with neuroscience. And so based on the successes of the Human Genome Project, which is another massive public-private partnership that had done this big high-profile project to map the human genome successfully and then, of course, privatize the technology in all kinds of ways, the Obama Brain Initiative aimed to do that kind of mapping. And the point is that this kind of correlationism between either diagnostic entities or behavioral manifestations or behavioral capacities, those were going to be correlated with some real discrete biophysiological state such that we could say what these psychiatric disease entities, quote unquote, really were. It's hard to really overstate the almost Jacobin radicalism of the project. For instance, Thomas Insel, who was at the time the head of the National Institute of Mental Health, issued funding guidelines that were we are now no longer funding any kind of study that doesn't posit a biophysiological mechanism that's being investigated, which, so to translate that practically, it means we don't really, we're not going to fund, for instance, investigations of whether CBT works because that's not elaborating a biophysiological mechanism. And the mechanism in that
talk therapy is flimsy. We're looking for hard science.
Exactly. And it's this sort of real reach for neuroscience to cling to as this sort of real hard science that's going to save psychiatry from dissolving into this embarrassing soft science, social science. And so in this context, there is a renewed push for different kind of technologies that reinstall the electrical view of the brain as being primary. And so it's within this context that you have, for instance, the rise of small clinical trials of deep brain stimulation for depression. These are conducted by Andres Lozano and Helen Mayberg, originally at the University of Toronto, and then Mayberg moves to Emory. I believe the first study is published in 2006, and then there are a series of small trials that get underway, leading to the idea that there's going to be a big FDA trial that begins in 2009. I can talk more about that history, but this rise of the BCI paradigm research program and optimism around that really comes at this particular moment in this oscillating hegemony between chemical and electrical paradigms on the one hand, and also a crisis of legitimacy in the field of psychiatry, coupled with this sort of establishment of federal funding around a project that is modeled on the Human Genome Project and this public-private and privatizable vision of science that really marks Obama-era science policy, all of which is sort of ideologically overseen by this very much Obama White House brain kind of thinking that mental illness, especially increasing rates of mood disorder, can be solved through like smart, targeted, technical intervention. There's this kind of like technocratic imaginary. Like this is, I think, how you have to understand the establishment of that research, the reestablishment of that research field. And then, as is usually the case with Elon Musk, he like vampirically parasitizes onto these research fields, gets a ton of military industrial complex money, gets a ton of either public money or like cannibalizes publicly funded research, and then rebrands it as being this revolutionary new thing. And like, it's all a long way around the barn of saying it and indeed, no, it is not.
Elon Musk loves identifying sources of public subsidy for giant corporate profit only to out himself as a total fascist set on dismantling the entire administrative state that has nurtured his entire rise. What a world. So what does Musk pledge that Neuralink can do for us tomorrow? And as you keep previewing for us, why indeed will he not be able to find the depression node in our brains and spark it just right so that we're all good and normal from here on out?
There are so many ways into this question. I'm going to try to answer it as best I can. One is, let's say, a problem with the capacities of clinical trials to produce the kind of knowledge that would be necessary to find that kind of correlation. Another is a problem with the correlation itself. So maybe I'll take the second one first. The DSM, I think we're currently on version like 5 point, I'm not sure what, of the DSM, but the DSM was created essentially to provide a nosology, that is a system of disease entities. And that nosology is presumed and was presumed by its originators in 1980 to correspond to some discrete, localizable, biophysiological disease entity. The problem with something like generalized anxiety or depression is that there are many, many different ways that you can have depression, in the sense that you get diagnosed with it by having 5 out of, I think it's 9 behavioral symptom manifestations. And if you have 5 or more and you've had them for more than 2 weeks and it's not related to some immediate cause like a death in the family or a breakup or something, then okay, you have depression. But those behavioral manifestations can differ enormously. One person might be eating a lot, not sleeping very much at all, and be really psychomotor agitated. And another person might their behavioral manifestation might look totally different. So just at that level, right, there's no guarantee that, in short, the concept of depression, the disease entity conceptually of depression, maps onto one discrete thing at all at a neurological level. So that's right out of the gate. Another problem here is that while movement disorder is pretty easy to treat using electrical stimulation because you can map movement pretty easily, when it comes to using DBS for essential tremor, the patient is awake They have local anesthesia at the skull so that they're not in pain, but they are awake. And you move the electrode around, and you know that you found the place to put the electrode when the tremor stops, right? And so like that correlational project, that mapping project, that aspiration that like map will collapse into biological territory is pretty straightforward when it comes to movement, which is in some ways like the most simple behavioral manifestation that you could imagine. When it comes to complex, psychosocially mediated disease entities and behavioral manifestations like psychiatric disorder, that process is complicated for so many reasons. So the story of brain stimulation for psychiatric disorder since its revival in the Mayberg research program is one that I detail extensively in my dissertation and then forthcoming book, but I'll just condense it for listeners here. Essentially, the Mayberg trials are small, with only maybe 6 to 8 patients per. Now, one of the reasons for this is that it is extremely difficult to recruit for DBS trials. Like, with very good reason, there are bioethical strictures on who you can recruit. And most notably, patients have to have failed all other available forms of treatment, which typically is like defined as like, I think 2 SSRIs, 1 MAOI, CBT, psychotherapy, a round of ECT, in order to say, okay, you have exhausted existing treatments, you are qualified as a last resort patient to try this super experimental thing that frankly may or may not work. The other thing is that in order to isolate that what DBS is treating at this particular target, the Mayberg target is the subgenual cingulate, but different studies have investigated different neural targets. In order to isolate and to say that this target and this device and this intervention does indeed treat depression specifically, is that patients have to have only depression and no other comorbid psychiatric diagnoses. Now, this is overwhelmingly not the case for most psychiatric patients. So you already have a very...
Sounds implausible.
You already have a very, very small number of people who fit that profile. And on top of all of that, they have to have a very specific type of depression where they are so-called high functioning. They can't be so depressed that they can't do the enormous amount of paperwork that is required to get all of their medical documentation to the trial. You oftentimes have to move to an area near one of the trial centers. Like, this is, to say the least, a logistically complex undertaking. And on top of all of that, it is overwhelmingly the case that people who fit that profile, that is chronic depression without any other psychiatric diagnoses, who have also exhausted all other forms of treatment, will have been diagnosed with what is called a personality disorder, an axis 2 disorder, which is a sort of leftover from the psychoanalytic faction of the DSM. It's like where Robert Spitzer et al. Stuck the psychoanalytic diagnoses in the sort of biological route installed by DSM-3. And so there's this sense, right, that if you failed all existing treatments, and this is a course of treatment that typically takes about a decade, then what you must have must not be medical, right? And so the thing is, in order to qualify for a DBS clinical trial, you also cannot have a personality disorder, because that threatens to complicate the treatment and the test of the treatment with something that is not biologically mediated, right? And so you immediately have a huge recruitment problem where most of the people who are going to qualify for this trial are not representative of the majority of people, quote unquote, who have depression. And oftentimes they will have to be re-diagnosed, or someone at some point will have to say, well, you were diagnosed with a personality disorder, but actually we think that that's not the case and what you have is treatment-resistant depression. What I want to convey is just before you even get to any of the implantation or behavioral metrics or different ways of testing to see if this thing, quote unquote, works, you're already just in a very dicey place in terms of like the type of population that is being recruited and their susceptibility to things like the implantation effect. So like, regardless of whether or not the implant is turned on, you often see in the weeks after the implant is surgically installed, big improvements in mood.
It's like a very powerful placebo. It's like, damn, this must be good. There's something in my brain. They put a machine in my brain.
So like, without, and I don't want to posit causality here. I am talking about what you can see in the clinical and psychiatric literature around this. Like, those are the facts on the ground before you even get to measuring how well this thing works. Okay, so one thing that's important to note is that in small trials, you're getting lots and lots of face time with the clinical team. These people are being told that they are, in a sense, kind of like scientific argonauts, right? They're like heroically offering their bodies to science. And you have to think about like the way that also the structure of the clinical trial itself as a social formation might affect subjective changes in how people understand whether or not their life has meaning, right? So that's one thing.
Especially given that these very severe forms of depression are often characterized by extreme isolation and a sense of the meaninglessness of one's life and of the universe.
In order to qualify for these trials, you are not working. You are at home. You are not getting a lot of social interaction. And so in a way, like, I mean, my ethnographic fieldwork was, I spent 7 years in these labs conducting these clinical trials. And so I watched this, like, in the role of this exemplary and in many cases heroic patient, this becomes a job in like a prestigious job for these patients. Again, I'm just mentioning that as a fact. Draw your own conclusions. And so, like, surprisingly or unsurprisingly, the early trials of the Mayberg target, which was the subgenual cingulate, were enormously successful. They're like near miraculous improvements for these patients. And as the sort of DBS research paradigm for depression began to gather steam, and Mayberg's proteges were also starting their own clinical trials, and it was kind of like this, research network emerging. And by the way, Mayberg became like a poster child for the Obama Brain Initiative, right? Because you could hardly imagine a more representative technology of this aspiration to do this neocorrelationist mapping project of the brain than deep brain stimulation, right? There was this language that emerged that Mayberg had potentially found the quote-unquote depression switch, as if depression were like, a discrete thing in the brain that you could switch on and off. So there was a push towards a FDA trial that would be double-blinded, that would be quite a bit larger than these small trials, that would aspire to the randomized clinical trial, like the RCT standard that is used for testing pharmaceuticals. This was supposed to bring DBS for depression to market, and there was a real sense of optimism that this could be the next blockbuster treatment. This could be the next, Prozac. And so I think it was a real surprise to everyone in the field when the FDA trial, which aimed to recruit 200 patients total, shut down in 2013, having implanted only 90 patients because the efficacy benchmarks were not being reached. In fact, it was not doing better than placebo. And so the question was, what the fuck and why? And so, like, as you can imagine, DBS enthusiasts had one set of explanations. DBS skeptics had another. But the pro-DBS faction essentially doubled down on the idea that we are targeting a real biophysiological entity. It might just be the case that there are many subtypes of depression, and this target with this device works well for some subtypes of depression and not others. In one sense, it's like, well, that might be true. Certainly, it does seem that to the extent that one's biophysiological state corresponds to a subjective state, that is, to the extent that human beings are embodied, yes, there is going to be a correlation between a biophysiological state and a subjective state. But this does not necessarily mean that there is a discrete disease entity that can be located. So there was a sort of return to small-scale clinical trials, and the federal funding structure, loosely describable as the institutions around the Obama Brain Initiative push, had to sort of step in to provide the funding in the wake of the FDA trial failure. Because as you can imagine, Medtronic and St. Jude, now Abbott, were not particularly jazzed that they had invested so much in this trial, only for it to kind of be a bust. So the state of play now is that BCI research is really focusing on movement disorder, which has well-elaborated promise for near-term clinical efficacy. A lot of the funding for BCI research especially in terms of psychiatric indications, is being provided by either military funding through DARPA, EARPA, or is just coming through federal funding structures like the NIMH, the NSF. I think it remains to be seen under Trump, in general, what those funding structures will look like. But until the election, that was the state of play. So that's what's happening with psychiatric DBS right now, is that I think that there is a real question, even within the field itself, about whether this is going to actually work out. And the problem, I guess, more generally, is that because the DSM system is downstream of clinical observations, that is, to put this differently, depression is a concept that is made out of language, human interaction, social cognition. Depression is a way that we describe a feeling, but it is necessarily inflected through history. Depression is conjunctural thinking, biomedicalized conjunctural thinking. And so there really is no guarantee that we may be hunting for a phantom in looking for a discrete biophysiological disease entity that we can fasten to that concept. Indeed, most people at the cutting edge of DBS research will tell you, it seems like there isn't just one disease entity called depression.
They're looking for a more and more fine-grained map, but it might be the wrong map for the wrong territory.
In general, I think that basing claims for the manipulability of human subjectivity through brain stimulation on the basis of findings generated through movement disorder research is really an apples and oranges situation, because the project of producing that neurological map for movement disorder is just a different, I'm mixing metaphors here, different barrel of fish than the project of doing that mapping project for complex, subjective mood states.
Hi, this is Olufemi O. Taiwo, and you're listening to The Dig. You can support the podcast at patreon.com.
This episode is brought to you by our listeners who support us at patreon.com, and by Pluto Press, which has loads of great left-wing titles, perfect for Dig listeners like you. One that you might like is Empire of Normality by the neurodivergent Marxist philosopher Robert Chapman. Endorsed by Steve Silberman, author of Neurotribes, this groundbreaking book exposes the very myth of the normal brain as a product of intensified capitalism. Exploring the rich histories of the neurodiversity and disability movements, Chapman shows how the rise of capitalism created an empire of normality that transformed our understanding of the body into that of a productivity machine. neurodivergent liberation is possible, but only by challenging the deepest logics of capitalism. Dig listeners get 50% off their first order of this or any book from Pluto Press using the code DIG50, that's DIG50, at plutobooks.com. The first time around, in the mid-20th century, electrical stimulation of the brain was tied up with CIA funding, MKUltra, research on prisoners, suppressing black militancy, and that was a big part of what led to it becoming so controversial and being discontinued. This time around, dating back to the 2013 launch of Obama's Brain Initiative, it's all being propelled from the intersection of big tech and DARPA military funding. Why is this sort of brain tech always so sketchy in such similar sorts of ways?
I think a lot of historical work remains to be done to elaborate exactly how much quote-unquote deep state or parapolitical funding for brain stimulation research there indeed was in the 1970s. As I argue in my work, I do think that there was MKUltra funding for what was at the time called electrical stimulation of the brain, or ESB. But you can also just see on the books, right, in the research papers that were being published in the 60s and the 70s, this grant was provided by the U.S. Air Force. This is not a matter of historical dispute that there has been a lot of military funding for the development of brain stimulation. The wide push against brain stimulation that culminated in the 1973 hearings over psychosurgery and behavioral modification chaired by Ted Kennedy, in which brain stimulation played this kind of lightning rod role. The social movement against ESB research relied on suspicions that this type of research was being done in a variety of carceral facilities. And in my forthcoming book, I make the argument that I think at least some of these accusations and suspicions were indeed correct. But at the time, there was no smoking gun that anyone could point to. It was just a sense that in the same way that the lobotomy had been tested on minorities and women, that the same thing would be happening with ESB. There's an interesting rhyme here, if you think about it, though, with the history of Adderall, to take something that we've even discussed on this program, right? Where it's in the 70s, Adderall is not something that you necessarily want to be on. It is being tested on Black children in state care facilities. Fast forward to the late 90s, and suddenly you are lucky to be able to get on Adderall, right? And so I think that there is this kind of way in which brain stimulation echoes that kind of it's first introduced as something that should be tested and therefore be tested on the most vulnerable populations, and then goes through the neoliberal looking glass to become this technology of the self, a way of optimizing and improving one's human capital, something that participates in this endless optimization and commodification of the self's capabilities. I guess what I would say is when it comes specifically to the vicissitudes of brain stimulation research, I think that it can't be overstated how much the, let's say, political plausibility of ESB, or now BCI, as a technology tracks the political plausibility of a variety of surveillance technologies. So think about the iPhone. If you go to a normal average person on the street in early 1970s and you're I'm going to give you a device that records everything you say, everywhere you go, everyone you talk to, they're this is what that movie, The Conversation, is about, right? It's hell no. And in the same way that I think just in general, the idea of privacy, the idea of fundamental self that that exists in private has been essentially destroyed through the rise of what we can shorthand as surveillance capitalism. I think that's the condition of possibility for the return of brain implants, and the idea, even though I don't think that it will be realized, the idea or aspiration that this would be some sort of mainstream, widely used bioenhancement technology.
When Elon Musk, trying to describe this as something that would be attractive to people, describes Neuralink as, quote, sort of like if your phone went in your brain.
Exactly. I would like the opposite of that.
What a nightmare. Bessel van der Kolk, he's the author of the 2014 bestseller, The Body Keeps the Score. And he is, you write, quote, the world's most famous living psychiatrist. And you wrote this amazing New York Mag piece. And you write, quote, somewhere along the way during the Trump years, among the heady thrashings of Me Too and the soul-searching doldrums of the lockdowns and the average listener of The Daily discovering white supremacy, trauma became the inflationary currency through which we transact our lives. Why did this sort of thinking, what you call traumatic literalism, that trauma is literally embedded in the body, physically embedded, why did it become so popular, such foundational common sense when it did and for whom it did?
For those of you playing along at home, forgive me if I point out the obvious, but this sort of idea that trauma is a literal biophysiological state of the body comports with the general sort of renewed biological turn represented by the DSM-3 in 1980. And indeed, PTSD was first installed in the diagnostic system in 1980. So first of all, let's just keep track of that correlation. I guess one way in here, though, is to talk about what's going on with race science currently, because it certainly seems to be back, right? And it seems to be back in this sort of naked and unapologetic way that would have been, unimaginable, even, I don't know, eight years ago. I mean, I think, don't you feel that way?
Well, it had a big moment in the 90s with the bell curve, a weird big moment.
Right. You have this sort of 90s moment of the popularization of sociobiology and sort of E.O. Wilsonian thinking. But I think that one of the things that I would like to point out is the way that traumatic literalism, this idea that trauma is a discrete biophysiological thing in the body, comports with, in general, this sort of biologization of politics, or the idea that you can boil down any subjective state to some sort of biophysiological state. And that biophysiological state is ontologically or metaphysically what the subjective experience, quote unquote, really is. And I think that this is behind the project of neuroscience, right? But I think we should just keep track of the way that that sort of thinking lends itself to a biologization of politics that is similar in kind to the sort of thinking that, is rampant nakedly on the right now, that one's politics or one's political capacities or proclivities can be straightforwardly deduced from someone's biology. So one of the arguments that I make in my profile of van der Kolk is that, implicitly, but I think it's there, is that in some ways this new traumatic liberalism is kind of the middle brow, polite, liberal genre of race thinking that is, everywhere so prevalent. One of the things that I didn't get a chance to talk about in the piece at length is, if you think about literalism as a mode, it is this idea that there's a one-to-one way of extracting meaning from its mode of articulation. The text and the meaning totally collapse into each other and are equivalent to each other. And I just want to point out that the DSM in which PTSD is installed is published in 1980. What else is going on in American culture in 1980? Well, you have the rise of constitutional originalism as the sort of Reaganite ideology of the law, which is this idea that the law should be interpreted literally. And you also have the rise of different evangelical movements that form a huge part of the Reaganite moral majority that takes a doctrinal approach to Scripture that holds that, for instance, the world was literally created in 7 days, that there is a literalness to scriptural text that is going to form the basis of this like newly militant movement. And so like, I think that maybe at the level of the zeitgeist, you can sort of think about the rise of traumatic literalism as coming out of this melange, this cultural zeitgeisty level turn in American culture towards the literal as some sort of like guarantor of one's politics, regardless of where you are on the political spectrum. And I think, too, that the liberal resort to science, I think a lot of times about those yard signs like, in this house we believe in science, right? It's like, I think there is this liberal tendency to resort to science as some sort of grounding for one's politics that places it beyond contestation, beyond interpretation. But it's like, my question is always like, whose science? In this house, we believe in what sort of science? Like, do you believe in like privatized carbon capture to solve the climate crisis? Or do you believe in like, there are a lot of different types of science. Like, that's what I'll say. So that this is
We've mentioned one, race science.
Right. Yeah, I mean, precisely. And so like, this is maybe more of like a drive-by point. But I think when it comes to, let's say, the development and elaboration of traumatic literalism, it's really, I think, localizable in this idea that van der Kolk was enormously influential in propagating, that traumatic memories, or the memory system that is used to store trauma, is different than this sort of narrative memory system that you use to remember the name of your childhood pet or what you're supposed to get at the grocery store. And so, weirdly enough, this originates for van der Kolk not in any sort of like neurobiology, but he was in the late 70s working in a sleep clinic for veterans in Boston. He published a paper essentially arguing that the nightmares that these veterans were having were not dreams in a psychoanalytic way of thinking about dreams, where the dream has complex symbols that are a sort of melange of the day's activities and unconscious forces. And essentially, he was saying these dreams that these veterans are having are not amenable to interpretation. Rather, they are play-by-play, literal recreations of the traumatic event. Therefore, like, the same sort of interpretation does not apply. So the point I'm trying to make here is that if you want to think about the intellectual genealogy of traumatic literalism, which I'm like periodizing to the 80s, it's interesting that it originates with this paper that really doesn't have much to do with neurobiology at all, per se. It's about saying that this text, let's say, the dream, should not be interpreted. It should, in fact, be taken as just announcing outright its meaning. There's a one-to-one correlation between what the dream does not represent. That is to say, it is a literal creation. It is a literal presentation of the thing itself, not a representation. And so downstream of that sort of theory of representation, you have all kinds of implications for what kind of knowledge claims can be made. And indeed, the strength of traumatic literalism, its rhetorical force, I think, derives from that idea that what's going on here is not representation. It's like empirical. It's like straightforward presentation in some way, and therefore like can be verifiable. And so this becomes hugely important in the development of memory science, especially around what is now sort of glossed as the recovered memory movement.
So this movement where people claim that they have discovered repressed memories of being abused, sexually abused as children, these sorts of claims become very prevalent during this period and very controversial.
Yes, and I want to tread carefully here because I think that it's very easy to lapse into this kind of presentist gotcha mode where it's like, and the recovered memory movement was totally fake. It was mass hysteria. Like, that's not at all what I would like to say here. But it is true that the sort of van der Kolkian idea of trauma as being a biophysiological state of the body that is carved into the nervous system through the existence of an alternate memory system, a non-narrative memory system, is key in the development of this entire what becomes like cultural discourse and movement. The first thing to be said is that can we be quite sure that there was an enormous prevalence of unreported child abuse and child sexual abuse and incest in the 80s? Indeed, I think we can. Like, this sort of stuff is very common even now. I don't think it's like conspiratorial thinking to acknowledge the prevalence of child abuse and child sexual abuse. However, I think that the popularization of traumatic literalism as it traveled from scientific research through like the talk show circuit and Dr. Phil and Oprah and this sort of cultural circus around recovered memories that, you know, in many cases was about a sort of not about structural critique of the prevalence of like child abuse and sexual abuse under patriarchy, but about these fantasies of like satanic abuse that people could recover through this like personality altering. Like, this is like the moment at which diagnoses of multiple personality disorder become very prevalent in it. And you can see like this like spike in incidences of that disease entity. Like, I think that there is obviously the idea of recovered memories, even in its sort of circusification that occurred in this moment, resides on this idea that the memory is carved into or like exists somewhere in the body's biophysiological system and can like be excavated. It can come to light.
As if pulling a file from the archive that had been hidden under some other papers.
Precisely. I mean, the metaphor that's often used at the time is like tape, as in tape recorded tape. I think it's important to mark that the evidence for the existence of this alternate memory system was not dispositive or conclusive at this point. The traumatologists, as they were called, like this sort of camp that there was a stronghold around Bessel van der Kolk and Judith Herman in Cambridge in the 80s and 90s. There were indications that there might be an alternative memory system, but the actual mechanism for that alternate memory system remained to be elaborated. And I think that in that space, that gap, a lot of the more outrageous or sensationalistic popularizations they lived there. I will say that as ludicrous as some of the claims of like satanic abuse or multiple personality, so on, like recovered memories, as ludicrous as some of those were, there was, very careful work being done in some cases by, I think about Jennifer Freyd's work, for instance. She's the progenitor of what's called betrayal trauma theory. And a lot of her work focuses on what it means to know something and how knowing something, for instance, knowing that you were raped by a family member as a child, resides in socially distributed forms of meaning-making and cognition. Like, can you know that that is what happened if the category of rape is not available to you as a child? Or indeed, like, if rape is not defined in a way that describes your experience as a child? Which is not even to mention, like, what it means to be able to know something within a family culture or a social system in which your knowledge is suppressed. So like, I think in that sense, there are different ways of thinking about how it could be possible that someone could come to know something later about their early life that they, quote unquote, did not know. I don't want people to get the idea that I am dismissing the discourse out of hand. But like, notably, so it's Jennifer Freyd's case that becomes the basis of the real backlash against the recovered memory movement. So like, the False Memory Syndrome Foundation is started by Jennifer Freyd's parents, because Jennifer Freyd comes to understand that she was sexually abused by her father, and that she does not make a public accusation. She's like a young, researcher in psychiatry, and she just says that she realizes this and says, like, you guys, mom and dad, are not welcome to stay at my place for Christmas. And the mom and the dad basically freak out, start this huge campaign against her in which they're like sending letters, anonymous letters to her departmental chair, trying to get her fired. And eventually they start something called the False Memory Syndrome Foundation that becomes this like hub of activism against what are perceived to be the increasing overreaches of the recovered memory movement. But like, I think it's like no accident. Like, do I believe Jennifer Freyd? Yes. I have looked into this extensively and I do believe Jennifer Freyd. And so like, whatever we want to say about the overreaches of the movement, I think that the Jennifer Freyd case offers like a valuable corrective for like regrounding our apprehension of that historical period in its like political valence.
Returning to more recent history, van der Kolk's book, The Body Keeps the Score, was published in 2014, but it only took off in a giant way, I think, a few years later. Why did traumatic literalism become so meaningful for so many the way that it did over the past decade?
You can't only explain this in terms of the self-help boom during COVID, because actually, if you look at the sales of the book, the beginning of the spike actually predates the lockdowns, but certainly COVID plays a role here. I guess I would say that what's notable for me is that in the first wave of popularization of trauma science around the recovered memory movement, let's shorthand it, like the 80s and 90s popularity of van der Kolkian trauma theory, the literalism of that trauma resided in not necessarily a neurophysiological literalism, because indeed the mechanisms for this second memory network had not yet been elaborated. The literalism in play there was that one can have a memory that is literally true, a memory that you achieve in a therapy session is quite certainly, according to this mode of thinking, not telling us something about maybe your transference to the therapist or your reaction to what a therapist might want you to say. It might not be an encoded critique, like it might not be a screen memory. It's the idea that like these memories can emerge from somewhere deep within the brain wholesale and should be taken literally. In its second iteration, like the second time around of like van der Kolkian popularity, I think the literalism is neurophysiological, and there are a variety of mechanisms that van der Kolk and his allies have propounded for how the second memory system might work, much of which seems pretty legit. There are changes to, let's say, what's called like the HPA axis in the brain after exposure to chronic stress. There are changes that are observable in like hippocampal activation between people who have experienced a traumatic event and people who haven't. There are observable changes in the neural connectome pre and post traumatic event. But I think that the generalization of the trauma concept, in the sense of its movement from being a concept that is applicable only to a relatively small group of people who have survived an explosion or accident, right? Like a discrete traumatic event, versus the sort of generalization to this idea where like eventually like everyone has trauma. that is something that really kind of has to be understood at the intersection of two things. The first is the explosion of funding for investigations into the neurobiology of trauma that are downstream of the war on terror. I know that DIG listeners might have heard Nadia Abou-El-Hajj's wonderful interview on the basis of her book about the ways that PTSD as a diagnosis have been, since the war on terror, used to sort of frame American empire within a particular language of moral injury. But like after 9/11, in that 10-year period, there was a tenfold increase for Department of Defense funding into the neurobiological mechanisms of PTSD. And like that's like one part of a general funding structure change that happens. So like there's just more trauma research happening in the early aughts, going into like the publication of Body Keeps the Score in 2014. And the other thread to track here is the development of a sort of neoliberal mode of subjectivity, political subjectivity, that is based off of one's identity being defined by different modes of injury, different forms of exclusion. Wendy Brown describes this very...
In states of injury.
Very capably in states of injury. Exactly. And so like, I think that these two things kind of come together to condition a certain moment in the zeitgeist in which everyone essentially becomes prepared to do race science on themselves about their trauma. What else is happening during COVID? White people are desperate to be included, essentially racialize themselves like within the context of like George Floyd, right?
In the absence of the possibility of solidarity as a way to understand the way that various people fit together in a political movement for all of our liberation. Instead, it's like, oh, how do I get oppressed person status too?
I mean, yeah, and it's like you don't have to like lapse into like Tucker Carlson-y trauma Olympics thinking here. It's like let's think about the way that political concepts work to condition the horizons of possibility of like how it's possible to articulate a claim within any given conjuncture. Do I think that it is an accident that J.D. Vance's appropriation of trauma discourse happens at exactly this moment where there's literally a rearticulation of whiteness within the idiom of liberal politics of inclusion and trauma race science? Like, no, it is not an accident, right? And so like, I think that in that way, Body Keeps the Score zeitgeist dominance is indexical to the resurgence of race thinking across the political spectrum.
It's pretty notable that people are turning to van der Kolk's literal body trauma at this moment of, as mainstream accounts like to put it, racial reckoning in the United States, because van der Kolk himself has a theory of how to end mass incarceration, and it's not the one that was being called for in the streets the summer of 2020.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I'll just like mark here that van der Kolk himself was an SDS guy who like came up during this, 70s counterculturally moment in psychiatry where like he, I think the vicissitudes of van der Kolk's thinking, political thinking here is maybe dispositive of like a general development of American liberal thinking in this period. So I'll just say like, during the course of reporting for this profile, I was at a retreat that van der Kolk was running. And in general, when you're with these trauma people, like there is almost no geopolitical event that they don't consider as addressable through like the conceptual apparatus of trauma. This is like maybe not a surprise, but it's certainly notable. Over the course of this retreat, one of the things that van der Kolk said was that we could end mass incarceration through early childhood attachment intervention. And I brought this up with him later, and we got into a big fight about it. And, it's not that I'm calling van der Kolk specifically racist. I'm just pointing out this race thinking here meaningfully. If we think about trauma as being this instantiation of some sort of biophysiological state in the body, we have to be really careful to not fall into sounding exactly like Bill Clinton talking about super predator Black children. Like, how does this meaningfully differ from the idea that one's biophysiological state somehow justifies particular forms of state violence and and incarceration? And so I do think that there is a kind of race thinking in the way that people are reaching for the trauma concept, liberals especially, that I find really, really troubling. I mean, there is a reason why I end the piece with a German physiotherapist talking about clean and purified bodies. I think that there is a kind of latent fascism in the way that a lot of this kind of traumatic literalism discourse is tending.
Those households that believe Black Lives Matter and that science is real do indeed contain contradictory multitudes. Speaking of the desire to become clean, I want to turn to RFK's anti-science politics. What in this house we do not believe. I want to turn to RFK's anti-science politics and those households that do not believe science is real. What forms of pervasive American common sense about health does that politics reflect? We've been talking about the science is real politics. What are these politics? Obviously, RFK is a unhinged, profit-seeking grifter, power-hungry person whose opinions on vaccines could lead to truly dystopian public health outcomes if implemented. But he's also right that industrial agriculture is a plague upon this country. What sort of common sense does RFK Jr. encapsulate, and why does that common sense resonate so powerfully among so many at this moment? And then in particular, why is it that this sort of wellness politics, the so-called medical freedom movement, what is it about it that creates for so many people this sort of particularly efficacious and often quite sudden entry point into far-right politics, almost as if it's like a portal that people can step through overnight sometimes?
I think one of the things in play definitely is a sort of disaffection with the institutions of science that intensified during COVID, but had been a long time coming in many ways, and is not without its validity. For instance, to take only the development of SSRIs, right? It is a fact that in the 90s, the manufacturers of antidepressant drugs were reporting data from these clinical trials in very selective ways, and that there was a capture of psychiatry by the brute sort of corruption of the scientific process by money and big pharma. And you're not crazy to have some suspicion of a lot of the scientific establishment around the commodification of health in general. This is not crazy, right? It is not insane to have a critique of the deregulation of the American food pipeline such that American food is poison. That's true. That is true. I just want to mark that. I think that this suspicion did really intensify during COVID, and not for no reason. I mean, the wildly vacillating instructions that were given people, some of which was I think it was a mistake for the CDC to say, don't buy masks during a period in which there was a fear that this protective equipment would be hoarded. And so there was there were instructions that really vacillated. And I think that people were quite rightly left wondering whether indeed these organs of government science did have the everyday population's best interests at heart. So that's one critique. I think in a broader sense, though, this type of thinking about health that seems to be what do we know about it? It's really tied to influencers. There is this sort of, we could almost say, libertarian epistemology in play, where these forms of knowledge making about like seed oils or raw milk or any of this other health stuff seems to gain legitimacy in some ways to the extent that it does not participate in large institutions of science. We know that it resides in this sort of literalist fantasy of purity, whether that's gender can be straightforwardly deduced from some sort of biophysiological fact, or masculinity and femininity can be purified through the elimination of like unnatural hormones and additives. Like, that's what we know about it. And one thing that I have been thinking about a lot recently is Antonio Gramsci's idea of organic crisis, which I know your listeners might be familiar through the really wonderful series that you've had with Michael Denning about Gramsci. But like, for those listeners who haven't, Gramsci's idea of organic crisis is that essentially like all of the institutions of legitimacy production and hegemony have broken down. People do not feel that the institutions of civil or political society, like Congress or the NIH, let's shorthand, represent them. And within these moments of generalized breakdown, there is a possibility for radical alternatives to emerge, like socialism or barbarism, right? And one of the things that Gramsci points out is like it's in these conjunctures that you see the rise of what he calls Caesarism, these strongman figures who claim that they are standing astride history and like shaping history through this like this power of the individual. And this is one way to think about this sort of influenceriness of this new alt-right health movement. Is this just Caesarism for science? I think that's like one way of describing it. I want to just, as someone who was trained as a medical anthropologist, I am hesitant to engage in this kind of aren't they so stupid discourse. Certainly it might seem to like you or me to be ridiculous that the government has these secret med beds that it's hiding from everyday people. All of these other like different conspiracy theories and forms of belief.
Or that elite pedophile cabals are stealing children and sadosadistically sexually torturing them to extract adrenochrome, for example.
I think that is there a meaningful difference between your everyday NPR listener talking about intergenerational trauma, which is, the jury is really out on whether there is this kind of like mechanism for that kind of epigenetic transfer between generations. This sort of like essentially like woke neo-Lamarckianism of the way that your average liberal like talks about trauma science, and maybe the types of thinking that are prevalent on the right in like less formally educated populations about the mechanisms of their health beliefs. I would say in the delta between those two in terms of like quote unquote scientific literacy or legitimacy like might be less than we would like to think.
I want to close by talking about how we should think about mental health on the left. I have a big problem as an organizer with discourses around self-care. Do not get me wrong. I think people should definitely take care of themselves. I think burnout is a very real thing. I'm very committed to therapy. I do it almost every week for so much of my life. But I think we have a situation where sometimes people feel anxious or socially averse, too depressed to take action. They flake out, drop out of groups, start avoiding a comrade to whom they've made organizing commitments. And all of that to me, and I'm curious what you think, it does seem kind of wrapped up in some of the trends that we've been discussing throughout this interview. And for me, this is, to share something personal, being politically engaged has long been extremely important for my mental well-being, relative mental well-being, striving for equanimity, whatever. I was in a very serious mental health crisis in middle school. And I really came out of that by becoming a fanatical left-wing activist in high school. And that's like the train I've been on ever since. And it hasn't like fixed me, but it has sort of like fixed me in the other sense in terms of like grounding me on this earth.
This is perhaps the first time, I've heard someone describe being involved in an organizing project as making them more sane instead of driving them completely crazy. But go on.
Yeah. So maybe it's a Joan Baez quote or something. Action being the antidote to despair. I think it was maybe her. What's your take on sort of like where some of these colloquial ways we talk to each other about mental health on the left come from? The sorts of organizational problems, lack of discipline it can lead to, and how we should maybe strive to think about it and care for ourselves and each other.
There may be several different things that I think of in relatively discrete ways that are captured by this question. So maybe like the first step in answering it is to just draw out the differences. When it comes to organizing, like there is good cause for despair right now. I feel pretty bad. And although despair is not a luxury that we can afford,
it's real.
One is tempted to live outside of one's means right now. Like, it is not looking good. It's certainly not looking good.
Things are looking very illiberal.
It's not looking good. And so, like, when it comes to, like, how discourses of self-care or mental health or whatever operate within organizing contexts, at this point, I think that if we are serious about doing political organizing, I think like in the same way that one has to sideline a lot of different types of nonsense in general, we have to maybe get serious about the way that different forms of self-care discourse are mobilized to like wreck organizing projects. Like, I think Sarah Schulman's like conflict is not abuse is a really useful intervention in that case, or in that sense, but also like it doesn't say anything that someone who is a serious organizer with some amount of experience doesn't already know, right? So that's one thing. In terms of more generally what left strategy and policy should be with regard to how we think about the role of neuroscience, psychiatry, the mind and brain sciences as fitting into or not fitting into the left's project right now, I really think that we need to be more strategic in the way that we use, for instance, neuroscience to make claims. So like, I don't know if you remember, like during a moment when AOC was like at the migrant camps that were being established under Trump 1 and indeed are back with the fury now, I remember hearing and seeing a lot of this discourse that children being separated from their parents was bad because it would influence their developing neurobiology. And it's like, well, that might be true. Is that the main reason why it's bad? I don't think that that is the most powerful argument for why that's bad. And so, like, we need to be able to articulate a vision of positive rights, positive political programs that doesn't, like, reach towards, let's say, neurobiology to fill in that, the absence of a positive political program. However, I also think that we need to be strategic in, how we make arguments to different people. And so, like, if invoking that particular argument is useful to you in a particular organizing context, like, by all means, go for it. I guess the last thing I would say is that in terms of a positive vision that I would have for how the left can think about biology and psychiatry and in the mind and brain sciences in general, I think that there is a space for thinking about the plasticity of the body within the context of its environment and how what sort of environments and social formations we would want to build that would produce health in whatever way we want to define it. I think that having a political vision for biology in that way is important. However, I do not think that this has to be articulated only through psychiatry and neuroscience, right? Because there's a sort of inherently medicalizing and individualizing function to a lot of these psychiatric or neuroscientific discourses. And so, like, I think that we need to work on developing ways of talking about biology that do an end run around the sort of political dead end of individualization that is so prevalent in many of these discourses that come out of neuroscience.
Well, Danielle Carr, thank you very, very much.
Thank you so much.
Danielle Carr is a historian and professor at UCLA. She writes about the political history and present of the brain sciences. Thank you for listening to The Dig from Jacobin Magazine. As Marx once said, after noting that the increase of lunacy in Great Britain has kept pace with the increase of exports and has outstripped the increase of population, while other podcasts have only interpreted the world in various ways, our point is to change it. We're posting new episodes most weeks. The Dig was produced by Alex Lewis. Our associate producer is Jackson Roach. Music by Jeffrey Brodsky. Our operations manager is Sylvia Atwood. Our senior advisors are Theorio Francos and Ben Mabey. Check out our vast archives and newsletters at thedigradio.com. Follow us on Twitter and also Instagram at thedigradio. And please find us wherever you get podcasts and make sure you are subscribing to this podcast. If it's on iTunes or Spotify or wherever, please also rate and review us positively. Those reviews help introduce us to new listeners, but what truly does that is you telling people to check out the pod. Explain why you like the pod, why they might like the pod, etc. Please make propaganda for us. And do find us at patreon.com and make a monthly or annual contribution to keep this operation up and running strong. Even a few bucks is huge.